Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's having a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragonsjewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan, and I'm just going to get all that wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way first. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so. It's just down below there. And of course, any love, comments, suggestions, all those wonderful things, there's that comment section down there. And don't forget to hit that like button as well. Today we are going to be doing our Ghostly Echoes series, and we had been going through the province of Alberta. I have now finished up Alberta, and we are moving west to British Columbia, also known as BC. So those will be the next series of ghost stories that we'll be covering starting this episode. We'll see how far we get with those, and I hope you guys enjoy these next few spooky tales. This story takes place around Prince George, British Columbia. A glimpse of the past. In the early 1900s, Rusty Campbell traveled around most of the northern British Columbia. He was able to support himself by trapping and mining. Although it was for the most part a mirage existence, at least it was his choice. Rusty's reminiscences indicate that he deemed that the freedom to explore the ruggedly beautiful country of the north was worth sacrificing what comforts might come with a more secure life. After a few years, however, he did find the loneliness difficult to bear, so he was delighted to meet up with a like-minded fellow named Jimmy. One fall day, sometime between 1909 and the outbreak of the First World War, the two men headed off to stake out some trap lines. The pair paddled portages their canoe northward from Prince George. After successfully clearing the rapids at Giscombe, they went further north and east on the McGregor River until they found the combination that they had been looking for: isolation and an abundance of wildlife. By spring, they would have enough pelts to make them both wealthy men. Although their individual prosperity was extremely important to both Rusty and Jimmy, so was their friendship. For this reason, they divided the area to be trapped as fairly as possible. After all, they were intent on exploiting the area, not each other. Rusty's allotment followed a creek down the slope to where it eventually entered the main river, within a stone's throw of a small island on which stood the remains of Surprise City. As Rusty explained, this is really no city, nor the remains of a city, but rather the tumble-down ruins of some winter quarters which had been constructed of logs years ago. Whether by dedication or from actual information garnered at area trading posts, Rusty concluded that the buildings had been constructed by a surveying party in the early days of the 1900s. He described coming across old cabins now half hidden in a heavy growth of mountain alder and young spruce and balsam trees, and added, perhaps optimistically, "I think even today the crumbling walls and old fireplaces could easily be found, although now thoroughly in ruins." Scuttlebutt among the trappers indicated that there was something decidedly unusual about this abandoned settlement. Rusty himself noted that he had heard curious tales of canoe parties making a landing on the beach on that island at the dead of night, and of people hearing voices of men when they hurried down to the landing to give a greeting. There was only the gurgling river and murmuring dark spruce to return it. He also knew that the surveying party that had built the structures on the island had packed up, glad to leave the lonely island. One cold winter day, Rusty was out checking his traps when he realized that it was getting dark and that he was too far from his base camp to make it back safely. He knew that he'd have create a shelter in which to pass the night. Fortunately, it was not numbingly cold that evening, and the river was not even completely frozen over. As an additional factor in Rusty's favor, he gratefully noted that there didn't seem to be a storm brewing. The most imposing force of nature that Rusty expected that he might have to contend with was the wind blowing the deep snow about. Feeling as contented as possible under the circumstances, he made himself something to eat, arranged his bedroll, and soon fell asleep. I was awakened a short time later by the sound of voices and the banging of canoe paddles against the side of a canoe frame. Thinking I was dreaming, I threw back my sleeping robe and sat up. Little could be seen towards the river or island of a gusty snow curtain was driving down the valley. I clearly heard the sound of paddles and poles being thrown on the beach as if a landing was to be made. Suddenly the snow rack of an obscuring curtain blew aside, and I saw what looked like a party of canoemen disembarking on the beach. It was not till I had returned to the snugness of my sleeping robe that it dawned on me that a canoe could hardly come up a frozen river, and that a stony beach, 4 feet under packed snow, could hardly be expected to give out the sound of wooden paddles being tossed on it. Fascinated, Rusty Campbell continued to watch the drama that was apparently unfolding before his eyes. They seemed to be unloading camp gear and what looked like long musket-like firearms from their canoe. 2 of them, carrying what may have been an axe, climbed the low bank and disappeared among the trees. A voice with a decided Scottish accent seemed to be calling instructions and was answered several times in soft French-Canadian patois. But the distance and the wind prevented me from distinguishing any words. Rusty Campbell continued to describe the strange sight. One man in a dark fringed skin coat was handed a crutch as he painfully climbed out of the canoe and sat himself down. With every indication of extreme weariness or pain, I had just decided I should rouse myself and throw some fresh wood on my fire, as an indication of my presence, when the whole scene became bloated out with a gust of heavy driving snow. Rather than wait for the wind to die down so that he could go visit the newcomers, Campbell decided to go back to sleep and to greet the men in the morning. As he drifted back to sleep, he could hear the dull sound of chopping and the occasional murmur of voices through the storm. One man sang a snatch of what seemed like a French-Canadian shanty, and then there was silence from the voyagers' camp. He continued, in the morning, after getting my fire going again, I noted about a half-foot of new snow had fallen during the night. No sign of morning smoke was seen towards the strangers' camp, but nevertheless I strapped on my snowshoes and went across the narrow strip of ice channel to investigate. There was no sign of a canoe, no half-filled tracks in the snow of any persons making a landing or climbing the bank, and no sign of any person having made a camp on the island during the night. I turned to the stretch of open water below the island and snowshoed along its margin to where it dipped under the thick ice. It was scarce 50 paces long, and the ice bridge at its close was at least 18 inches thick. It had not formed during the night, that was certain. There was no open water as far as I could see above the island. Shaken by what he'd seen, or more correctly, hadn't seen, Rusty Campbell made his way back to the area where he'd camped the previous night. He ends his report by suggesting that the reader might be at least as well equipped to come up with an explanation as was he, the witness to the strange event. Although Rusty had no explanation for what had happened before him that night, about a century ago, it would be a safe bet to speculate that he had experienced retrocognition, that he had seen a ghostly replay of an event that had actually taken place some years previous. This story takes place in Victoria, British Columbia. The Gravlin Ghosts. The following British Columbia ghost story has become a Canadian classic when the popular Victoria Times sports editor Victor Gravlin married his girlfriend. A privately employed nurse named Doris, no one could have predicted that their love story would end in tragedy. As it turns out, their story would never really have an ending at all. No one alive today recalls the exact date on which the pair was married, but it is known that they had separated by 1934. Although she still cared for him, Doris could no longer tolerate what Victor's drinking was doing to both his health and their marriage. She packed her bags and moved on. The pair maintained contact with one another. However, Doris did not consider it odd that Victor contacted her and asked her to go for a walk with him on September 22nd, 1936. They met at the Oak Bay Beach Hotel. What happened after that meeting can only be conjecture. Doris may have noticed that her husband seemed exceptionally depressed that day. Certainly, others who had dealt with him that week recall being concerned about his apparent unhappiness. All that is known for sure is that neither Doris nor Victor Gravlin was ever seen alive again. Doris's body was found 5 days later when John Johnson, a caddy at the Victoria Golf Course, went looking for an errant golf ball. He probably never found that ball. Moments after discovering Doris Gravlin's partially dressed and badly beaten body, he called the police. The authorities immediately began to search for Victor Gravlin. 4 weeks later, they found him, or at least the remains of him, floating face down in Oak Bay, with Doris's shoes in his pocket. It appeared that the deceased were victims of a murder-suicide. The tragic events were duly noted in the local papers, and then, for the most part, forgotten, at least until the mid-1960s, when Doris's ghost began appearing. Since then, there have been dozens of manifestations of the murdered woman's soul. She always appears in the spring, prompting the monthlier The April Ghost. And then the other consistencies in all the Doris Gravlin sightings. For instance, a dark mood prevails just before she appears, and a seemingly directionless wind begins to blow, while the air becomes cold and clammy. In 1964, 2 youths watched a misty gray female shape skim effortlessly over the rocky landscape by the water. It was clear to both of the young people that what they were witnessing was not of this realm. Others who have seen Doris, however, say that the ghost is in such a solid form that at first they presume that she is a real person. Still others report being frightened by an image clad in white running toward them and then vanishing before their eyes in a pool of white light. Some witnesses describe seeing a woman dressed in a brown suit and looking very much alive, just impossibly out of place in her 1930s style clothing. She stands on the side of the road as if waiting to cross. The majority of the witnesses to that version of the apparition are convinced that they've seen a real person, not a ghost. The only point for those folks to ponder is why the lady's wearing a period costume, and one that's out of season to boot. A familiar image of Doris is also seen wearing a white dress. Some say that it is a wedding gown that she has on, and others are inclined to think that it's her nurse's uniform that they've seen her wearing. If it is indeed her husband who killed her, perhaps that's why Doris seems to enjoy tormenting men. George Drysdale was walking with some friends when he spotted the ghost in front of him. He immediately turned away in shock, only to find that the ghost was instantly in front of him once again. He whirled around a second time, but she persisted, effectively boxing him in as the others in his group looked on in horrified amazement. Finally, possibly tiring of her game, Doris's apparition disappeared as quickly as it appeared. Victor's spirit must have gone on immediately to its final reward, because no one has ever reported either seeing or sensing it. Every spring, however, the faithful still gather to wait for the April ghost to appear near the Victoria Golf Course at Oak Bay. There's another interesting spin on this long-standing ghost story. Some people believe that the ghost is not Doris's at all. They maintain that she is the ghost of Victor Gravlin's mother, who walks the area looking for her deceased son. Those who believe this version of the legend generally also feel that Victor was innocent in Doris's death, as the only two who knew the truth are certainly no longer alive to share it with us. We are left to make our own decisions as to the identity of the ghost and the guilt or innocence of the various parties. This story takes place in Saanich, British Columbia, an understandably unsettled soul. Craig Flower School in Saanich, north of the capital city of Victoria on Vancouver Island, was destined to be haunted before it was ever built. Although no one knew it in 1855, when the first building was being constructed, the educational leaders of this burgeoning community had chosen to build, if not on top of an ancient native burial site, then certainly right next to it. Recent archaeological exploration has revealed artifacts proving that the land had been used by humans for more than 2,500 years. Despite this tenure, no ghostly activity was noted until 1911, when a new school was built and the original building was relegated to serve as the caretaker's residence. From the moment it began, however, this haunting was a dramatic and full-blown one. One evening, early on in their tenancy at the residence, Mr. and Mrs. Hugh Palliser were relaxing in their kitchen when they heard the door of the adjacent woodshed open. Hugh Palliser got up to welcome whoever their unexpected guest might be and show him or her in via the proper door. However, the house door opened before he had a chance to get to it. But all that came in was a rush of dreadfully cold air, even though it was a calm September evening and that it was quite warm outside. A quick investigation failed to turn up anything out of the ordinary on the property, and so the couple prepared for bed before Hugh Palliser could turn in. He heard the shed door open once again, determined to catch what he now presumed was a prankster. Palliser stood quietly, waiting for the door to open again. It did, but once again the only thing to come into the room was a strong gust of cold air. He made a thorough search of the building and surrounding land, but found no intruders, nor any other possible cause for the bizarre occurrence. A short time previously, either during the construction of the new school, or possibly as a result of a bridge cave-in, a container of human remains had been found nearby. One of the Palliser's children had an interest in anatomy and had consequently been given the bones to study. Hugh reasoned that it was the spirit of that person who was suddenly haunting the house. He lifted the lid on the box of bones, and he could swear that the skull was grinning back at him. Quickly he closed the lid and carried the box well out onto the property. He dug a grave and reinterred the bones. Immediately, evenings at the former Craig's Flower School building became considerably calmer. Hugh Palliser went to his own grave without telling one exactly where he buried the restless soul. Although he must have done so with the best of intentions, his keeping of this secret has since caused some concern. Craig Flower School is now a museum preserved by the provincial government and recognized as the oldest surviving school buildings in Western Canada. Jerry Clark, the resident caretaker, was relaxing one evening much as Palliser was doing those many years before when he heard the woodshed door. When his dog suddenly began to react to the sound of voices from an adjacent room. Clark searched the entire house and the surrounding land, but could find no reasonable explanation for what he and his dog had both heard. On other occasions, loud noises have been heard coming from inside the school when it's unoccupied. The school bells will occasionally, and for no apparent reason, ring loudly enough to shake the entire building. What a shame that no one living today knows where the skeletal remains of the unhappy soul are hidden. Perhaps another move might calm the restless spirit. This story takes place in Chilliwack, BC. The Haunted Hall. In the Fraser Valley of Chilliwack, the museum is housed in the old City Hall, not far from where the haunted house on William Street once stood. The grand old building, constructed in 1912, routinely held prisoners awaiting trial. In 1928, a man charged with the possession of opium was thrown into a cell with another prisoner. While the man already staying in the cell was asleep, the new arrival stole his belt and used it to strangle himself. His tragic spirit has been in the building ever since. The entity can be heard walking about when the rest of the building is known to be empty. The back door will clearly be heard opening and closing when no one is near it. Perhaps the long-deceased prisoner is enjoying in death the freedom denied to him in life. There is no longer any lock in the world that can hold him. He's free now to leave and re-enter any building whenever he pleases. This story takes place in Chilliwack, BC. Portrait Possessed. The following story comes from Chilliwack, which is near the eastern end of the Fraser Valley, a few hours' drive eastward from Vancouver. It is such a classic tale that it virtually supplies a dictionary definition of the phrase haunted house. In addition, there is a chilling twist to this ghost story that is virtually guaranteed to raise a few extra goosebumps. The year was 1965, and the Fredrickson family was delighted to be moving into a large old home, complete with a dramatic turret on William Street. Hetty Fredrickson, a painter, looked forward to having room to pursue her craft while her husband Douglas was at work and their 5 children were at school. What Hetty ended up painting in the new house was very different in all ways from what she had intended. The couple first noticed that not all was normal in the 12-room house shortly after moving in. Furniture in an unused upstairs bedroom would not stay as they had left it. An oversized bed moved mysteriously about the room, and the drawers in a bureau stored in the room would always be found open. With so many people living in the house, such activity might have been ignored, with each family member thinking that another was responsible for the changes. The Fredricksons, however, weren't allowed such a luxury because they could hear a ghost walking about in areas of the house that were supposedly unoccupied, by corporeal beings, that is. When the ghost came close to them, they could smell a distinctive fragrance and even hear the ghost's breathing. Although understandably disturbed to realize that they had purchased a haunted house, the couple made the decision to stay on. It was then that Hetty's reoccurring nightmares began. She dreamed of a woman lying on a floor. Hetty sensed that the scene had taken place in the family's home, and yet oddly, she didn't recognize the particular area where the woman lay. Almost in contradiction to that confusion was the clarity with which she could see the image in her dream. The entity itself was so clear in Hetty's dream that she began to paint the person that she had seen in her dream. Using her artistic talents, she tried to replicate the dream image. The mummified-looking body, the cheap yellow and red cotton house dress, and the look of terror on the face. Little did Hetty suspect that this painting would only complicate the mystery further. Each day, she would add to the woman's picture, but she soon discovered that the portrait had taken on a life of its own. It began changing overnight as the artist slept. Each morning, she would find that the painting looked less and less like a woman and more like a man. One morning, the image on the canvas had even grown a mustache. Word of the strange going on in the William Street home began to spread, not only through the community, but throughout the Fraser Valley and beyond. People started to arrive at the door of the haunted house in droves. The Fredericksons did not appreciate all this attention suddenly being paid to them, but the ghost apparently did. It responded by gaining strength, significant strength, to allow Hetty to see it not only in her nightmares, but also when she was awake. The sighting began as a glowing mist, and then solidified into a discernible shape, the shape of a human body. Each time it appeared, the apparition soon faded, leaving behind a lingering scent of perfume. Anxious to understand the problem that they were living with, the Fredericksons began to research the history of the house that they had just bought. Though they weren't able to come up with anything specific, they did discover that there were a lot of rumors in the community about the big old house on William Street. And none of those rumors were pleasant stories. Some said that a man had killed himself in the house. Others had heard that a woman had been murdered there, and that her killer had disposed of the remains by cementing them into the chimney. At least now the Fredericksons felt that they had a clue as to why their house was haunted. They began to investigate room by room, looking for the concealed body. Their efforts were rewarded in that the couple found that the house was even bigger and more interesting than they originally thought. Tearing down a false wall revealed a boarded-up bedroom that they hadn't been aware of. Although neither of the Fredericksons had ever seen the area before, Hetty recognized it immediately. It was where the body in her dream lay. During all of this investigation, Hetty continued to work on the portrait that she had started to paint. The mustache was slowly disappearing, as mysteriously as it had appeared. Even so, the picture refused to look like a woman. For now, it showed the outline of a beard. Word of the strange going on in Chilliwack had been picked up by the media and spread throughout the world. The Fredericksons allowed 2 journalists to spend the night in what had been the hidden bedroom. The ghost did not make itself visible to the reporters, but there were unexplainable noises throughout their stay, and a piece of linoleum moved of its own accord. After the 2 had filed their report, the haunted house became something of a provincial tourist attraction. Most of their charging, the Fredericksons now had to deal with curious tourists flocking to their door. In addition to the original inherent disadvantages of living in a haunted house, finally everyone in the family had had enough. They packed up. They not only left the haunted house, they left the mainland entirely. Once they were settled on Vancouver Island, the family tried to put the whole unpleasant experience out of their minds. Meanwhile, the Chilliwack house stood empty for months and became a target for vandals. To prevent further disintegration, the Fredericksons invited a group of musicians to move in and live there as long as they liked. The group did not even have to pay any rent as long as they cared for the house. The musicians were more than happy to comply with that simple request and carefully maintained the property. All of them were well aware that they were living in a place reputed to be haunted, and yet not one of them had an unusual experience in the house. Eventually, the Fredericksons sold the place. The musicians moved out, and a new family moved in. The strange occurrences began all over again. Doors and drawers were banged closed. The thermostat would be set 10 degrees higher than anyone in the earthly family was comfortable with. They felt decidedly uncomfortable in the basement of the house, and their pet dog occasionally shook and cowered as though frightened by something that no human could see. When the children in this household began to experience night terrors, the parents decided to cut their losses and moved out. After they moved, the old place on William Street was vacant more often than occupied. But even the lack of inhabitants did not stop new ghost stories from surfacing. People spoke of an unexplained shadow moving about the house. A courier approached the house to deliver a parcel, was startled to see a woman holding a baby suddenly appear on the front porch, and then just as suddenly disappear. There seemed to be no solution to this ongoing haunting. The house was either up for sale or unoccupied for many of the following years. No one, it seemed, could stand living there for very long. Then in the mid-1970s, a fire of unknown origin started in the cellar of the haunted house. Soon flames engulfed the entire structure, and the place burned to the ground, taking its supernatural secrets with it. This story takes place in Zimbalist, British Columbia. Susie's Spirit. The town of Zimbalist, between Nootka and Kayuk Sounds on the west coast of Vancouver Island, was for a while in the late 1930s a hub of great economic excitement and energy. Veins of gold had been discovered in the area, and folks were coming far and wide, hoping to tap into the valuable natural resource. Just as those who had sought gold during the rushes of the 1800s had required services, so did the would-be miners of the later era. As people attempted to supply those services, Zimbalist became something of a boomtown. Businesses catering to the miners' needs cropped up as required. Those undertakings in turn brought even more people to the area. Susie Wu was one of those who toiled away at a job created by the gold rush. She washed laundry at the town's hotel. Part of the arrangement in her employment apparently dictated that she also lived in the hotel. And history tells us that Susie eventually died there. The circumstances of the woman's death were not suspicious, so the hotel's owners merely redid her room and began renting it out, along with all the others in the building. This approach was clearly not an idea that pleased Susie's spirit. The first encounter with the laundry worker's ghost did no more than startle the guests in Susie's former home. She simply appeared to them, but that appearance was enough to have them ask for an alternate accommodation. By the second sighting, Susie's ghost had become more aggressive, because she chased 3 men out of the room, down the stairs, and into the lobby. If she intended to frighten them away, her tactic was effective, because they refused to go back to the room, even to pick up the possessions that they'd left behind. A man employed by the hotel to make minor repairs apparently refused to be dictated to by a phantom. The man confronted Susie's spirit and told her not to bother him. She never did again. For the most part, though, people associated with the Zimbalist Hotel are content to let Susie Wu have her eternity alongside their lives. When they hear footsteps in the empty hallway or feel that they are not alone, or worse, are being closely watched, they know that Susie's merely making her presence felt. The hotel's owners made one concession. The room that Susie once called home is no longer rented out to overnight guests, but is used now as an office. Susie's spirit seems to appreciate the change.